All right, hello and welcome everyone to the session Laying Foundations for Growth, Designing a Student Employment Program Built on Professional and Personal Development. Today we have Andrew Yager and Franklin Ofsthun from Pretty Library at the Universities of Shady Grove. Just a few reminders, this session is being recorded. If you look in your chat box in your Zoom panel, be sure to send chats to both panelists and attendees so that everyone can see them. And then just a friendly reminder to use the Q&A panel at the bottom of the Zoom screen to put in your questions for our panelists so we don't lose track of them in the chat. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Andrew and Franklin.
Thanks. As a quick note, this session is recorded, so keep that in mind. Thank you all for coming to our talk today. I've been very excited about this conference since I heard it announced, and from the presentations I've seen so far and all of the participation, it seems like there's a great congruence in a lot of our perspectives on library management. I'd love if you could introduce yourself in the chat. Just let us know where you're joining us from. And if you could, let us know what your student employees get out of working at your libraries.
This presentation is about how our library began to change our student employment program, incorporating more person-centered practices and developmental opportunities for students. Our hope is that our experiences can prove helpful in justifying and motivating you all to look into similar changes in your own libraries. We know that many of you may already incorporate lots of these ideas and practices in your programs, and that's great. However, we also recognize that many libraries have significant budgetary and staffing limitations, which can make it difficult to implement a system that necessitates a lot of hands-on management. With that in mind, throughout our talk, we've included what we call one-day remodeling tips, really leaning into our building metaphor here. There are ideas you can implement in a day or two to get you thinking about bringing more student-centered practices into your program and coming up with new methods that can work for your particular situation. We also would like to incorporate a land acknowledgement at this point. So at the University of Maryland Libraries, we believe it is important to create dialogue to honor those that have been historically and systematically disenfranchised. We acknowledge the truth that is often buried. We are on the ancestral lands of the Piscataway people, who were among the first in the Western Hemisphere. We are an indigenous land that was stolen from the Piscataway people by European colonists. We pay respects to Piscataway elders and ancestors. Please take a moment to consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us together here today. Thank you. In the interests of making this presentation a bit person-centered as well as the content, we felt it was important to give you a little bit of our backgrounds to help you understand where we're coming from, both professionally and personally. Pardon me. My name is Andrew Yager. I am the coordinator for access services and acquisitions at Universities at Shady Grove. I'm a white, heterosexual, cisgender man, and I have almost 20 years experience working in academic libraries, from a student employee to a department manager. I also have extensive retail experience, especially at frontline and lower level management positions. I also have strong opinions about the librarian staff dichotomy in academic libraries and the divide in opportunities and incentives it engenders, differences that I feel are also reflected in the ways we've traditionally treated our student employees.
And I'm Franklin Ofsthun. I'm the library services specialist at Pretty Library. I am a white bisexual trans man. I studied psychology and social work in undergrad, actually at the Universities at Shady Grove, where I was a Pretty Library student employee. So I have that in common with the employees we currently supervise. I also worked in food service for many years, and I was a writing tutor in college, which definitely shaped my outlook on training and learning. I'm also neurodivergent in a variety of ways that materialize in difficulty with reading and attention and processing sounds, which definitely impacts my training and management styles as well. Andrew and I are both white men supervising a student body that is mostly not white. This definitely impacts and limits our outlook and influences how others perceive us and how we perceive them in turn. We recognize that we have to work to overcome inherent biases that can impede us, and we try to make the unconscious conscious, but we're sure we miss as many biases as we catch. It's a continuing process to unlearn harmful patterns of thought, which we will continue striving to do. So a little introduction to USG. The Universities at Shady Grove is a regional learning center founded in 2000 with the purpose of providing an affordable degree-granting institution to Montgomery County, Maryland residents. Essentially, we offer classes from 9 different Maryland state schools on one local campus. It's sort of like the back end of community college. So all of our transfers, or all of our students are transfers that are junior or senior level or graduate students. And most of them spend about 2 to 3 years there. This is a relatively small student body with approximately 3,500 undergraduate and graduate students. And it's non-traditional. Our undergraduate student body is 28% white, and our undergraduate students have an average age of 28 years old.
By way of introduction to our specific library, as you can see, we're a pretty small library as well, although during pre-pandemic times, we did see a solid number of patrons every day. We have a similarly small staff. We have 2 full-time staff in Franklin and myself who are in charge of the students, as well as access services and a few other areas, and 3 to 4 librarians. Our small size and shorter time frame means that we can be very agile organizationally. We try to be a pilot library, trying out lots of different ideas to see how they work. Before we get into the discussion of our particular student employment situation, we felt it was a good idea to go over one of the primary concepts that underpins our new philosophy, person-centeredness. Incorporating that as a primary design philosophy was a significant departure for us in the way our library operated, but it isn't revolutionary from the perspective of psychology or business. In fact, it's actually somewhat in line with how non-exempt and exempt library staff are already managed and evaluated at the universities of Maryland.
So getting a bit into my background in psychology here, when talking about person-centered in psychology, what we're talking about is person-centered or client-centered therapy, which is a type of therapy pioneered by Carl Rogers in 1942. Not to be confused with Mr. Fred Rogers, although Mr. Rogers did base a lot of his philosophy on teaching of children with using Dr. Rogers' person-centered framework. So you might recognize a bit of that philosophy throughout this. In person-centered therapy, the therapist treats the patient as the expert in their own life. Person-centered therapy is typically used for people who aren't experiencing severe or acute mental illness issues, rather on people who want a little help in gaining self-confidence, a stronger sense of identity, and help with interpersonal conflicts. The main 3 principles that person-centered therapy is known for are, firstly, unconditional positive regard, which means therapists must be empathetic and non-judgmental to convey their feelings of understanding, trust, and confidence that encourage their clients to make their own decisions and choices. Empathetic understanding is it means that therapists understand and accept their clients' thoughts and feelings. And lastly, congruence, which means therapists carry no air of authority or professional superiority, but instead present a true, accessible self that clients can see as honest and transparent.
This concept crops up frequently in management and business literature too, which often suggests adopting a people-centered leadership style. There are numerous benefits to such philosophy, but the most measurable is a long-term improvement in employee engagement, which coincides with higher morale, greater employee retention, improved accuracy, and superior productivity. The term itself is a little squishy in business literature. There's no one single definite definition, but person-centered leadership generally includes recognizing and encouraging employees to bring their whole selves to work, which means making sure their whole selves are actually welcome. This concept intersects with many diversity, equity, and inclusion best practices, as it also means recognizing, incorporating, and celebrating differences among our team members. It also involves expressing genuine empathy and care for a person, getting to know them as a person and not just an employee, and being supportive of their efforts and time spent both on and off the clock. Inevitably, this does mean you will be changing the roles to match the people in them more than the other way around. Making changes and accommodations like moving a shift to a less stressful time or incorporating work they find engaging emphasizes them, their strengths, and their interests. Person-centered leadership also acknowledges that growing out of a position is just as important as growing into it. By encouraging a person to develop in ways unrelated to their current role, you unlock their strengths and create opportunities for unplanned benefits to both organization and employee.
So instead of using this as a therapeutic approach or a strictly business model, we can look at this as a student-employee framework. We can use this person-centered approach to help student employees gain self-confidence, a stronger sense of professional identity, and the ability to build career skills and to trust their own decisions. Doing this essentially is integrating their role as a student and an employee by centering their learning at work. This differs from the traditional sage on the stage style of academic learning and instead focuses on guiding students to find their own answers and trusting they're the experts in their own lives and that they can figure it out. Additionally, as student employees tend to be more racially diverse than library management, it's especially important to build a relationship of trust and to incorporate the feedback offered by students of color in particular. Taking the three core principles of person-centered therapy, you can see how these could be transferable to student employment. So back to unconditional positive regard. Obviously, we're still managers and we need to communicate when employees aren't fulfilling their responsibilities, but we can enter that conversation with a clear respect for the employee as a person and to seek to understand their circumstances. For empathetic understanding, we can learn from and accept all feedback that students give us as valuable and valid. Even if they're expressing something we disagree with or we feel we've already accounted for, that is still valuable feedback. And for congruence, although we are the authority in the library role, we emphasize as much as possible that students are the authority in what being a student at the desk at this current moment means, and we understand how invaluable that experience is. Additionally, they all have expertise in their respective professional careers and in their lived experiences.
So our old student employment model probably looks familiar to a lot of you. It mostly revolved around assigning specific tasks in the stacks, like shelving and pulling holds, and customer service at the desk, answering basic questions and triaging more advanced ones. We did ask them to do a few other things, but it was overwhelmingly a matter of work that could be completed by following a set of instructions to the letter. Pardon me. Our annual reviews were almost entirely descriptive, rating performance on a 1 to 5 scale in a few categories, and including some general notes at the end. And from a management standpoint, this prefab model offers convenient, low-cost solutions to persistent challenges. Training all our students on a few critical but simple tasks allows us to spend more time focusing on our work. It was very good for getting those tasks done, no matter who was working or when they were doing it, and letting us go from hire to competence in a hurry, which was extra important for us given our short employment window. It can be really hard to justify long training periods for things that might take less time to do ourselves when we only get to keep the students for 2 years maximum anyway. It's a general rule. We also had to consider the on-campus job market. USG's student body all lives off campus, and many have jobs that pay better than we do already, so we can't afford to be too selective if we want to be fully staffed. A side benefit, if you want to call it such, of the low expectations we had is a reduced potential for catastrophic issues. Every library I've worked in, there's been a general perception of students as a little bit flaky. Whether that's true or not, if we don't ask them to do anything difficult, it doesn't matter. We don't have to worry about it. And that doesn't entirely come from us. Schools emphasize their status as the students above anything else anyway. It's why they're student employees. But really, most importantly, it kept costs and maintenance low. We didn't spend a lot of time or effort pushing students to do more than a baseline of work, which was designed to be as generic and universal as possible. And for the majority of that work, we could throw together step-by-step instructions and not have to think about it again for the rest of the semester. I want to be clear here, that did actually work out well for some students. They didn't have to stress much about work and could even get some practical experience using their academic knowledge, like when an education major used learned pedagogy on reference transactions. Even for those who couldn't bring in outside skills, having to find tasks and procedures to fall back on reduced uncertainty. That kept work from being mentally exhausting when it might be right before or after class. Of course, the flip side of that is it leads to disengagement. They got bored, focused on something else, and sometimes accidentally ignored a patron looking for help. Our students consistently mentioned appreciating the fact that they could get caught up on homework at the desk, but they usually weren't very approachable when they did. The prefab model also has built-in limitations on driving engagement for those who can't get into doing rote work. We don't have a budget to give raises or exciting incentives, and we couldn't justify creating a supervisory position with a small team that turns over so quickly, so performance rewards were going beyond the baseline were pretty minimal. Honestly, we just had really few motivational tools, and we didn't expect we could get our students to consistently develop much using them. So instead, we settled for getting them to do everything we quote unquote needed them to do. Objectively, however, that really undersold our students and also underserved them. They had skills and abilities that made them capable of more, but we didn't try very hard to determine what they were or how they could make use of them. We thought of working in the library as something students could put on their resumes, but that often wasn't the impression that they came away with. We didn't push them to grow or encourage them to think critically about the work, so unconsciously, we were really encouraging them to think of it as just a job. In this model, the ideal student employee was one who was always on time, completed assigned tasks quickly, and responded in a pleasant manner to patrons at the desk. That doesn't mean students couldn't benefit from their work experience, but it was usually because we put in extra effort, not because it was baked in. We also noted that for as much as this was procedural for students, our management was pretty checklist oriented as well. Whenever we got a new hire, we repeated the same trainings, assigned the same tasks, used the same language, and mostly evaluated the same things we were evaluated on when we were student employees. And to be clear, it worked. The program did exactly what it was designed to do: get part-time workers to complete low-skilled tasks and provide basic customer service without much oversight. Because really, remember, when we're talking about how efficient the system is, what we really mean is it's efficient for us, the managers. Rather than working with students to maximize the advantages of their employment for all of us, we shoehorned them into preconceived notions of what their role should be for our own convenience and comfort. This did make it somewhat utilitarian, but it minimized what they could get out of the work and presented challenges when students' learning styles and backgrounds differed from ours, not uncommon given the student body diversity at USG. Our old model was easy for us to implement and perpetuate, but that's because we were the target audience. Students accomplished basic work that we didn't have time to do with as little input from us as possible. This doesn't mean we weren't being supportive. We actively helped a lot of them with homework or personal concerns, and we suggested developing skills they could apply outside the library, but that was all extra. It just wasn't in the program's blueprint at that point, and putting it there would require significant renovations. Again, leaning hard into our building metaphors here. And speaking of renovations, here's our first set of quick remodeling tips. Whether you're metaphorically gutting the whole kitchen, or just applying a fresh coat of paint in the bedroom, any improvement project is going to start with planning. In this case, that means examining your current program and thinking about what you want it to mean for both you and your students. Here are a few ideas that you can bring out quickly, which may help kickstart your thinking on incorporating person-centeredness into your program. Try creating a list of the freedoms you currently give your students. That can get you thinking about how you already help them shape their roles and where you could realistically incorporate more of their input. Ask how they've described their job on a resume. This gives you some insight into how they view the work and where they may be missing some of how it's benefiting them. Even if you don't change a thing about the actual content of your program, simply changing how you explain or emphasize parts could completely change what they take away from it. Also, I really like this one, try drafting a student employee job description centered on the benefits they receive rather than the tasks you require of them. In this case, it may actually help to make two, right? So the first one would be what their current benefits are, which gets you thinking about what you already do that works. And the second could be what you think the benefits of their working there should be, which can reveal the changes you need to make to reconcile the differences between those two. While we recognize some of these issues we just discussed previously, many of them only came out once we started critically examining our program as a result of strategic planning and creating a new job description for federal work study. While we weren't sure about everything we wanted in the new program, we generally felt it should be more useful for our students and allow us to better leverage their abilities. In other words, library student employees should be library employees who were students. We knew that would mean we'd be spending more time supervising and managing, but we both felt that that was a worthwhile trade-off.
All right, let's talk a little bit about some of our goals for the student employment program. First and foremost, we wanted to prepare students for work after graduation. Universities at Shady Grove is a very career-focused campus, and we wanted to align ourselves with the mission of creating a stronger, better prepared workforce for the local economy. Secondly, we wanted to create more educationally high-impact experiences for USG students. If we have the ability to enrich our students' education with work, then we feel we have a responsibility to do so. We also wanted to stop wasting our human resource potential. We wanted to make sure that we were drawing from the excellent knowledge of our students who are all junior level above students in a variety of fields we don't have any experience in. Job engagement is famously underwhelming in the US, and we wanted to give students an example of how even part-time work can and should be engaging and interesting if employees are treated as individuals with the potential to grow. Of course, the library should be a learning environment, and we wanted to fully embody that, not just with how the general student body is, but how we really treat our student employees. And overall, we wanted to prioritize the improvement of our students' whole selves. We wanted them to be encouraged to grow in a variety of ways, not just in their library roles, or not just in the rigid idea of what was going to be the most important skill for when they graduated, but anything they felt that they could explore.
With these goals firmly in mind, we started thinking about implementation. We knew we'd have funding and staffing constraints, so we decided to focus on a few key areas. Since we'd be departing from our existing system pretty significantly, we'd need to retrain current student employees and revamp our training program for new hires. Beyond the content, we could take the opportunity to introduce new styles of learning as well. However, all the training in the world wouldn't help us leverage student abilities we didn't know about yet. To draw those out, we needed to get the students feeling engaged, and the most person-centered way we could see to do that was providing more autonomy and responsibilities. Since we were committing to more freedom anyway, it made sense to extend that trust to other areas, such as when and where they worked. Thinking about holistic growth and skills not inherent to the student role, we introduced the idea of continuous learning as a basic expectation of employment. Taking a page from HR, we could incorporate some of the same professional development tactics used for library staff, like formal trainings and skills workshops, as well as leaning on their academic credentials, inviting them to examine popular and scholarly materials through a workplace lens. Our old performance evaluation system wasn't really suited to this whole person growth mindset. We needed to describe their work, yes, but we also needed to give meaningful suggestions for long-term development, not just how to be a better library student employee. We also wanted to incorporate their own input on that growth, using it to drive our goals and planning, so introducing a self-evaluation made perfect sense. That said, a one-and-done model of introspection is not very meaningful, right? We have to make sure that they get used to giving mindful feedback both frequently and regularly, and both formally and informally. So to keep up engagement with the feedback process, we'd need to prove we valued it by making changes that incorporated their ideas and addressed their concerns. Our new program did have to work immediately, but if it was going to be person-centered, tailored to the specific students working with us, we'd need to see how students actually felt about it. That meant periodic review and modification based on responses, no matter how comfortable we felt with things. So when thinking about how to take the program from where it was to where we wanted it to be, we first needed to motivate student employee buy-in. That brings us to another set of our quick remodeling tips. These ones are about improving communication and making it more meaningful, emphasizing that it's a two-way street.
Probably the simplest method of improving communication is making it more frequent. So schedule mid-semester check-ins with your students so they can get used to having serious but not scary conversations about both work and their lives. Just like the hiring interview, you could come with a few open-ended questions in mind, including ones about the future. Do make sure to give them enough advance notice and reminders to think up 2 to 3 questions of their own as well.
You can also get them examining their current experience by asking them to explicitly state the ways that their classwork and library work inform each other. Relating the things they're doing and learning in and out of the library can help contextualize the value of it, even for those who continue to view the role as just a job.
So a quick question for you all, please answer in the chat. What do you do to develop your student employees that isn't explicitly geared to being a better library employee? Again, that's what do you do to develop your student employees that isn't explicitly geared to being a better library employee? I think a lot of you all have answered some of that already in your introductions, but if you wouldn't mind repeating it or reframing it a little bit, that would be very helpful.
Oh, I love the idea of matching it with the librarians who are their presumably their program liaisons.
Yeah, we've thought about that a little bit as well. That's a good one.
Yes,
Yeah,
definite
design.
attention for that graphic design. Yeah. Oh, dig it. Yeah, survey is great. That's sort of like a more directed version of some of the stuff we do in our self-eval stuff, and we'll get into that a bit later. Yes. Yeah.
I love that somebody mentioned mentoring. I think that's a big opportunity that is missed in how we can better our student employees.
And we all recognize that there's funding issues, right? So opportunities don't necessarily pop up the same way they would in a more formal workplace setting, but yeah. Awesome. So if you folks want to keep putting those in, we'll potentially have a chance to refer back to these later as well, but we're going to continue on for now. So we knew in late 2018 that we wanted to redesign the program, But our ideas have changed a bit over time. The important thing for us is to quickly get something from paper into practice, in part so we didn't have a chance to bog down trying to make the ideal into a reality in one plan. Here's where our identity as a pilot program library also really helped. It was easy for us to get buy-in from our director to give short-term changes a try, even if we knew it wouldn't be long-term. So as mentioned, we knew the first part of the new program that students would see was the training. We changed the content noticeably, but the biggest modification was the addition of new forms. Previously, we relied on lots of one-on-one sessions with new hires where we explained how to do things, supplemented by a few sets of written directions. That is somewhat inclusive. We can adjust our pace to the students' needs, but our primary goal was to work through that checklist ASAP, right? The faster we did, the sooner they moved from a managerial time sink to an asset who freed us up for other work. One-on-ones are still a major component of our training, but we acknowledge that they're not always terribly engaging. And it can feel intimidating to speak up if the boss is explaining something you just don't understand but think you should. Plus, some people just don't do as well in that kind of setting. In theory, it's very person-centered, literally one person and one person. But if it doesn't work for that specific student, it goes right back to being more about us than it is about them.
So starting with a solid foundation in training allows us to build competent student employees for the long run. Personally, I approach training in a similar way that I approached writing tutoring as an undergraduate student. I approached that training as a guide rather than being a talking instruction manual. And instead of handing students a detailed description of procedures, I prefer giving students a broader overview of what their shift at the library will look like, and then guiding them through the smaller picture practical skills that they'll be using at the desk. The main tool in our toolbox is using the I do, we do, you do tactic for training. I show them how to do something by doing it. Then they get to take the wheel as I re-explain how to do the task. And then they do it on their own while I observe and offer reminders until they're able to do it without any prompting from me. This tactic is a great way to make sure that shy trainees are actually absorbing the training and forces them to ask questions to be able to proceed. The most important thing in employing the I do, we do, you do training is being truly, genuinely patient with both the process and the student. It's going to take people different amounts of time to get different tasks. And if something you think it should automatically make sense, it might not automatically make sense to the student you're training. You have to have patience within that. You're not going to want to schedule this training to be during a time the trainer is very distracted or the library is super busy, even if it's kind of an inconvenience. If you can try to schedule at a time that is quieter, then you'll probably have more success in that. Because we want to give students a real snapshot of how their work will be before they do it, we schedule them at least one shadowing shift where they sit beside a current employee and observe how they handle various situations. Another aspect of our program is to hold refresher trainings at the end of summer and winter breaks. We understand that even our most competent student employees can benefit from periodic reminders about the details of work, especially after a long break. We also use this training time to introduce new policies, such as the introduction of a lot of new things for our new program, to provide students with deeper trainings from other departments, and to allow students who generally only work in pairs or alone to see and interact with their coworkers. Before remote work, group trainings were difficult to schedule frequently since students all have different schedules, and as a commuter school, they often live very far from campus. But having semi-annual returning trainings that involve several hours of work used to be really the only feasible way to allow for group interaction. Since the switch to distance learning, we've been able to meet as a group for trainings and refreshers far more easily and frequently, but it does come at the cost of feeling less natural and less casual than these in-person refresher day trainings felt. So everything starts with trust, right? When we don't feel trusted, we don't feel respected. And what we really want is for people to bring as much as themselves that they want to bring to a role. But we have to earn that trust. It could be as simple as allowing self-reporting of hours, or as complex as letting someone determine their own timeline for a semester-long project, but self-determination in the workplace is a major driver of engagement. So as much as possible, we try to give students the freedom in what tasks that they do at work and when. So when we're working in person, students know what they have to do on a given average shift. So they have relative freedom in structuring their own time. So during a given shift, they could be assigned processing mail, collecting holds, checking inventories, reshelving books, professional development, or collecting hourly headcounts. There are general times that those tasks need to be done, like headcounts need to be collected about an hour apart, but they do those tasks without prompting and decide amongst themselves who is doing which task and when. Having them manage themselves lets Andrew and I focus on other work that needs to get done, and more importantly, gives students a closer approximation of what work would be like when they graduate and start working on more self-directed full-time jobs. Now at home, students' work has become much more project-based. They have a few hourly shifts a week to help us monitor our reference chat and staff our virtual study room, but the rest of their work is even more self-directed than before. As a requisite of allowing students to set their own pace with work, we place a high degree of trust in our student employees, both that they're doing the work they say they're doing and in trusting their judgment. So when we're working in person, we didn't have a time clock and we weren't always present when their shift started and ended. So we needed to trust that they clocked in and out and recorded their hours accurately. Virtually, this is even more true now that they work reference chat hours later than we're online. And since they have too many projects going on for me to realistically track them all. And as for trusting their judgment, this is one aspect of training that lasts well past their initial training shifts for the duration of their whole probably first year working with us. We spend time trying to develop students' self-confidence in judging customer service situations. For this, I mean things like knowing when it's okay to let a student who forgot their ID stay for late night hours, or when to spend time teaching a patron how to print versus when to sit down and do it for them, or when they need to get a manager or a security because someone's being inappropriate. It's really important to give students time to watch more seasoned employees handle a situation so they can have many experiences to think back on when they're making those calls themselves. We start with trust as our baseline, but that doesn't mean we trust blindly. If we know a student has been having trouble with following one aspect of the job, we're going to check in and check on and see how that's going. An important component of this is that even if a student has broken a rule or messed up something, we always want to give them the default of having, the benefit of the doubt. It's human nature that if nobody corrects you, you're probably going to want to push the rules a little bit and take the path of least resistance. Our job is to correct while giving students the respect they deserve and explaining the reasoning behind the rules that we have in place so they don't think that we're just arbitrarily deciding what is and isn't allowed. Understanding the reasoning behind rules also helps empower students to be able to better navigate conversations where patrons feel the rules are unfair or they're arguing for exceptions. If a student understands the spirit and reasoning behind rules, they can enter that conversation with a lot more confidence.
Also, it benefits us, right? So forcing ourselves to really get into the why of rules and policies also helps us discover if something really does need to be done the way it's done. If not, changing it in a way that makes life better for the student employees or our patrons makes total sense.
Right.
Professional development in the workplace has many uses, but in the context of student employment in the academic library, two really stand out. It can drive engagement because it pushes student employees to think outside the box of work as procedure. And it also encourages conceptualizing improvement and learning as part of work. It may even help them make some new mental connections between their work and their academics or their interests. And most directly, it helps teach students newer advanced skills that can be of use in their current role, their private lives, and their future careers.
So one of the biggest changes we made to the program at large has been the addition of professional development activities. We require students to do a certain number of activities in each category by the end of the semester. So these categories are reading articles, viewing webinars, and attending workshops. We find articles and webinars with topics relevant to some of the key skills we've identified as highly applicable to a variety of professional fields. And we also have them attend our library workshops, which have topics like introduction to R programming or time management. They have the freedom to select from a list of topics that we add to bi-weekly to fulfill their requirements in an area that is relatively of interest to them. Now, to receive credit for completing their professional development activities, students complete engagement responses, which are designed to get them thinking about how they could really apply what they just learned in their professional and personal lives. The engagement response will also ask them to identify and assert ways in which an argument can fail to resonate. It can be difficult to teach students the importance of questioning something presented to them by an authority, but we want to foster that critical thinking as much as possible. So we initially started this program without having an exact idea of what skills we wanted to be emphasizing, and quickly realized that we could do more to be specific and give students the vocabulary to talk about their professional skills. We found a list of career readiness competencies, which was developed by the National Association of Colleges and Employers. I saw somebody mention that in the chat, so go NACE. We added a couple of skills to this list that we felt were particularly relevant to this library student assistant position, like research.
Using these as classifications for the professional development offerings also had two immediate benefits. Having definitive terminology helped us better search for and organize the articles and trainings we were providing as suggestions to the students, and it also made life easier for them to select which ones they wanted to read or view. To be fair, this list is not perfect. There's some overlap in several of them, and different students will find sources map best to different competencies based on their own conceptions. However, we do like the basic ideas behind them, and we do know that NACE also gets a lot of love from our colleagues over in Career Services and Student Success. So being both serious and intentional about adding professional development into the employment program is an arduous process. It can take weeks or months of planning. But there are a few ways you can rely on professional organizations to do the heavy lifting on the theory side and flip in some quick applications using their work as a base. In fact, that's our primary recommendation in this batch of remodeling tips. To start, just find a training for them to watch. We found promising ones on LinkedIn Learning, but there are lots of options out there. At first, you may want to look for one that has relevance to their actual library work, so you can justify them watching it on the clock to HR if need be. That on the clock part is important because it's the right thing to do. It's a job responsibility. They should be paid for it. And because it mentally changes from homework that's not for a class to compensated responsibility, which may help improve engagement and minimize distractions, like my cat you can hear crying in the background. You can also build off NACE competencies directly. Try to think about how your student employees may already be developing in those areas, or ask them how they think they're developing.
Key part of our program is the repetition of review cycles, where we have students complete a self-evaluation, we have a sit-down formal review, and we establish goals for their next semester of employment. So our major goals for these formal reviews are twofold. Firstly, we wanted students to learn how to judge their own performance while thinking about strengths and weaknesses. In order to accomplish this, the students complete a self-review where they are asked open-ended questions about their performance and their future work. We also have them score themselves in several different performance areas, as either above expectations, meets expectations, or needs improvement, and to justify why they've given themselves the score with examples of their work from this past semester. The second goal is to provide students with a relatively low risk, low pressure formal review experience before they enter the workforce and have these performance reviews come with the pressure of raises and promotions or the baggage of negative consequences. I am as explicit as possible with this goal for students because I want them to understand that this is an exercise done primarily for their benefit, and the intention behind it is not to sit down and tell them they aren't doing good enough. When a student doesn't meet expectations, we generally treat that as a problem that both we as managers and the student can find a solution to together. For example, if the student has trouble with attendance, did we schedule them for inappropriate times? Did the student's availability change partway through the semester? Or do they need to be more realistic about their scheduling needs? We always try to give students different projects that match their strengths and to help with their weaknesses. But as of our last evaluation period, we've incorporated a more concrete action plan for returning students. This plan includes completing projects for the betterment of at least one skill they've indicated as a strength and one they've indicated as a weakness.
And as supervisors, the self-evaluations actually make our jobs much easier. Building off our prior goals around freedom and trust, the self-evaluation is a really useful tool in incorporating self-determination over the longer term. They really drive that conversation between us and students about maximizing work they find rewarding and leveraging their strengths and interests. This opportunity for formal examination directed by students can help to reveal blind spots of our own as well. For instance, a couple of our students indicated that they were interested in working more on their intercultural fluency competency, and specifically on bringing more of their personal and educational perspectives on diversity into the library. Working with them to design related projects helped us better recognize where we were falling short on incorporating anti-racist practices, which we realized doing so could help our students of color feel more comfortable bringing their whole selves to the job. Also, understanding where a student sees their strengths and weaknesses can be really revealing, especially when we disagree with them. If we see them underestimating themselves, we can take steps to build up their self-esteem in that area and have a conversation to find out why they feel that way. If they're more confident about themselves than we are, we can use that difference to try to draw up new workflows or projects that they can use to convince us or help them grow their understanding of how that competency can be viewed. So whether or not you have a formal student-employee review process, these remodeling tips include a few ideas to encourage your students to think critically about their work experience. Putting together a good self-evaluation from scratch is hard, but chances are your HR department has already put together something for you, which you can then give to your students. You may want to change up some of the categories a little before you do, or you can leave it as is and see if they can make connections you might not have considered. If you do give formal reviews, have your staff think about development plans for students in them. Making explicit the connections between abilities they already possess and the higher order projects that can help the library accomplish more also tailors the positions to them personally, making it much more person-centered.
So between every semester, we make adjustments to the program based on our observations and feedback from student employees. We use feedback to listen to concerns related to their work, and we also use it as a meta improvement tool to improve the program itself, potentially including improving ways of getting feedback. Gathering feedback is an extremely important aspect of growing the program. Part of treating students with freedom and respect is knowing that they have the most authority and knowledge on what is or isn't working in that moment. And we need to check in with how students think things are going constantly, especially when we're implementing changes. We understand that people have different ways of communicating and that just having one form of feedback isn't going to capture everything. So we do have multiple avenues. The first of those is informal communications. Although these were easier in person, this is still huge for us. A lot of our projects have started with realizing students are bringing up a couple of the same small problems or frustrations with the work informally, or indicating they want to change something. One-on-one coaching is another thing we use. Our coaching has really been a discussion more than directive. We're doing things like checking in on student goals, but also seeing how they're doing and what have been the hurdles in their ability to do work. We also gather feedback during our discussions during the formal review process. That feedback tends to be about professional development and brainstorming about future work. We also use groups of student employees to do various things like learning more about what distance learning is like for USG students, as non-employee student interactions are a lot harder to come by remotely. On a more formal level, we do have students sit down and fill out an anonymous feedback survey for our professional development program at the end of each semester. We use that data to determine what we need to tweak about the program, like finding shorter articles or exploring new kinds of topics. Here are some of what we've used student feedback to better. Firstly, we use student assistants as one of our stakeholder groups for our strategic plan. They met with our consultant privately in order to give their input. We also had student assistants decide that the system we use to track our course reserve inventory needed a lot of work. So we planned alongside with them to figure out each step in that redesign. They helped us make decisions from what we needed to purchase to make the physical task easier. And on the other side of the spectrum, to help establish color variations in the document to assist with readability for a dyslexic student, and subsequently everyone else. Similarly, when a change in our ILL procedure occurred at a university level, we took that opportunity to reboot our ILL tracking system, and that solved a recurring problem thanks to Andrew and another student employee's great idea. Students who worked either opening or closing shifts helped us use their practical experience to help rewrite the opening and closing procedures, readjusting things, especially like the suggested timing that things should be done and the order of tasks. Beyond just collecting feedback, it's extremely important to use that feedback in visible, tangible ways to encourage more honest feedback and to better the program.
In the process of bettering the program, we tend to follow a three-part flywheel, with review, development, and implementation occupying roughly equivalent spaces. We think of it as improvement, not refinement, because our changes are based around the people we're employing at the time, not a universal distillation of excellence. It's entirely possible we could end up reverting back to a previous iteration's model if we determine the newest one is not suited to our current employees. Over the course of our iterations, we've seen some significant changes in the emphasis of the program and a host of modifications to the particulars. It's also worth noting there's overlap in all three stages here. So for instance, we gather feedback about the program itself using the feedback survey, but we're also actively gathering it in real time and making changes if we find an issue. Similarly, even before we get into formal development planning, we've already thought up some things we might want to do next, but we make sure to bounce it off the students first. So far, we've talked a lot about our programs, both old and new, some basic theory, our rationales, and methods. However, what really matters are the outcomes, which understandably are a bit muddled and hard to fully determine because our students generally end up graduating relatively quickly and they don't check back with us 3-5 years down the line. Not that we've been doing it for that long. We experience a lot of the same assessment difficulties that we see in other library services, like tying research consultations to academic success, but with the added challenge of a smaller sample size. We don't have anything like a definitive solution. What we do have is plenty of self-reported perceptions by the people around whom we're trying to center this program, the students. Overall, and especially at the beginning, some of our changes were not met with universal acclaim. We saw less resistance than anticipated in some areas, but it was more work and there wasn't any immediately obvious payoff for the students. As a result, it really was on us to make the case for all this in real time and to convince them it wasn't just busy work that felt a little bit too much like homework. There were also areas where the students just struggled to see the relevance or simply weren't buying what we were selling, especially in regards to some of the professional development activities. As you can see from our quotes here, articles were a particular source of consternation, at least early on.
Overall, students seemed to get what we were trying to do here, and that really shines through in some of their responses to the program survey, both initially and over time. We've seen them improve overall, especially in areas like applying critical thinking and their engagement responses and self-evaluations. And they've demonstrated an improvement in research and info literacy development through a lot of the projects they've done great work on. Overall, striving to be more person-centered in our management has been extremely rewarding. We're learning more from each new crop of students, and it's really rewarding to see things like students gaining confidence in how they talk about their strengths and seeing their skills improve. And as hard as it is to see them graduate, it feels good to know that we've helped them make the most of their schooling.
We'll go over questions that came in the Q&A section during the presentation now, but if anybody has any more, as the dinosaur says, please post them now. If not, we can also go back over some of the ideas you already added in response to our question to you 20-some slides ago.
Yeah, there is some very great chat happening over here, and I am very excited to read through these.
All right, going into the Q&As here, looks like we have 3 that are all ranked equivalently. So I like our first one here is, how can we encourage our student workers to perform duties beyond the medial when we're unable to pay them an appropriate wage to do so? Yeah, that right there is definitely a big question, right?
Mhm.
I feel like one of the things we just had to do was make it part of the work. To an extent, salary definitely matters. We all know that, especially. But at the same time, if they find the work interesting, if they find it valuable, if they find it something that is worth their time, they will make the time for it. You do have to pay them, period. Sorry, go ahead, Frank.
I think that's a good part of it is making sure that this is work happening on the clock. Another thing that can be really helpful, we didn't do this except for informally, but having some kind of like entrance interview, trying to figure out what are your students' majors, what are their career plans, what's the kind of work they've enjoyed in their past jobs. We're checking in with them about like what are the hardest parts of what they do now, what are the parts that are less horrible if they feel so menial. And I think that we made this change to having more professional development kind of work at the same time that we had been kind of ramping up our requests for them to look more present at the desk and doing things like looking up, working on their homework only when it wasn't something that was going to draw their attention away too much, and just kind of like ramping up the work a little bit, if that makes sense.
A big one on that also was we banned laptops at the desk. There is a desktop that they use for our ILS and all that anyway. Not looking like you're looking at multiple different things, you're just at the computer, which you might be anyway, is a nice optics improvement there.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Unrelated question we have next is what happens if there's a task that has to be done but is unpopular with all the students? And I think that sort of dovetails there. This stuff does still have to be done, and I think there's actually a later question about that too. Books still do need to be shelved, things, pickups, head counts, all that stuff still needs to be done. So we make sure that they know it's a responsibility. Like, it has to be done during this shift. We're not going to force them on who exactly is the one doing it or at what specific time, but it still has to be done.
I think there's also degrees to which different students find different tasks more and less unpopular. So there are things like we have some students who would prefer you to do something that's very like manual and repetitive, like checking our inventories. But there are other students that are more afraid of tasks that are like going around and talking to everybody and checking student IDs. If we let students kind of decide amongst themselves what they want to be doing, then sometimes they can find a balance that works for them. But there have been times that I have stepped in to say, I know that you're afraid of doing, ID checks, but it's really going to be better for you in the long run if you can walk around with me and see how I do it, or do something like that. So like you can kind of address that. But for skills that are things that are just unpopular with everyone, you just have to keep an eye and make sure that it's not just one person that keeps getting saddled with it.
And there are certain ones that are unpopular that have to happen at certain times, right? Like the person who's doing the noon is not the person who's going around checking IDs. That just happens to be the person who is scheduled to begin at the time when it's only USG folks who are allowed to be in the library. And you let them know when they sign up for particular shifts or give availability, what the requirements are going to be there. So it's important to bear that in mind, and that bleeding into the question about are students still completing all the same tasks as the old model? Yes. Honestly, we're a small library and our collection is also small, so we don't have as big a demand on stack work as at larger libraries. I have worked at ones where there has been massive demands on stack work, but as a general rule, I've found that the one-off, one-on model, stack and desk, is pretty common. If you have student employees working in multiple areas. And that being the case, there's plenty of time for the on hours to be a chance where they can maybe go back into the office and watch a training, or they can be reading articles and stuff like that at home. We make sure that they get paid for it. It is considered worked hours. And there's an expectation that you're not going to spend like 12 hours a week reading articles. But at the same time, that really is, the positional freedom, locational freedom, as well as task freedom is a big component of this.
True, Andrew, are you asking that that same question, or are you answering the anonymous attendee question?
That's the anonymous. It bled into the anonymous attendee. Yeah.
Sure.
The question is about what about students who have expectations they'll be able to study at work? That's nice for them. We've always approached student employees, and I noticed the comment about work study previously, but student employees, when they are on the clock, are employees who happen to be students. If they are coming into this position with the idea that student employees are students first and are doing employment stuff when they have chance, that's not what we're paying them for. we're going to give them opportunities to have employment be more than just menial tasks, more than quote unquote low skill or manual labor, but it is still work. We are paying them to do the things that we need them to do at the times when we need them to do it if the timing is important.
And I think part of it too is finding that balance and really talking about the reasons that rules are in place. Because if the rule is you're not allowed to do homework at the desk because it's not allowed and it's not professional, then that's not a very good rule, right? It's like the same as people who are working food service or in grocery stores shouldn't sit down because they shouldn't. It's like not a good rule. But if the rule is you shouldn't be doing homework at the desk because there are other things you can be doing, then that's something I can reason within. You know, if you take care of all of the tasks that you need to be doing at work, then you are allowed to do homework so long as it's, you know, on the computer, it doesn't have sound, it's something that you're going to be able to look away from because we need you to be aware of what's happening around you. So I found that if I'm able to allow a student to do work, I don't need to freak out because I notice that they're like typing their essay instead of doing something. If I suspect there's something that hasn't been done, then I can remind them. But in general, we allow them to do work.
I see how many professional development activities do we require per semester?
That's a good question.
Yes, we started out with 1 to 2 articles, 1 training / webinar, and 1 workshop. Again, these are workshops the library already offered, but we've since opened that up to other things. We've now increased the number, especially considering we're still working remotely. So this really gives them the opportunity to get more paid work in. But we'll probably stick with this number even once we're back in person because we don't find it particularly onerous. Franklin, if you can get into the particulars there.
What we're doing now is they read and respond to 3 articles per semester. That's for this last semester, and this semester we've done these numbers. So 3 articles, 2 webinars or other outside online trainings, and 1 workshop. The workshops are still the hardest to schedule because those happen at particular times. So we have left that as 1. We do allow students to do more than the minimum requirement. So there are some students that get a lot out of it, or they just want the hours, and they find it fine. And they will, I had somebody last semester who did it every single time. She did every single webinar, and I had another person do every single article. So letting them have the space to do more is great. It's very flattering when they actually do that.
Yes, and that also helps that we, one of the as you go projects that we can assign or just give them the opportunity to do rather than assign is finding more professional developments.
Right.
And when they see the articles and the trainings that their coworkers came up with, sometimes it really resonates with them more, and they can really prompt each other to say, hey, I found this cool thing. Why don't you read it? Also, in the chat, I see Megan asked how many hours our student employees are allowed to work per week. We're capped at 20 per week. We do have some work study students, FWS. We are not required to have only FWS because we do have some budget, but we usually, again, only have 13 to 15 student employees a semester, and they work about 20 a week. So there are some shifts where there's a single student working, and there are a few other shifts where occasionally it's just staff, or if someone calls out, it's going to end up with just staff.
Mm-hmm. I really appreciate all of the resources that people have been adding to the chat. I hope that there's a way to save the chat so that I can read over that
Yes.
when I'm not giving a presentation. They seem very good.
Yeah. Let's see if there's any other questions in the chat that didn't go to Q&A. Yeah, I also appreciate Sue brings up that stop referring to students as work study, both because of the financial aid stigma and because it implies that you study while you work. Yes. Now, we love from a financial standpoint the opportunity to have work study, but that's not what they are. That is just what they get. They receive work study. They are a student employee.
Yeah, thanks everybody so much for coming, and thanks to everyone who's done help on the conference ends in moderating the chat and technical issues and all of that, that you all have been very helpful. And thanks everybody for the very great chats that you sent.
And thanks for taking the time to watch. Feel free to reach out to us. It occurs to me we didn't include our emails here, but if you look up our names at University of Maryland Libraries, we're easy to find out.
Great. Thank you so much, Andrew and Franklin. Some really great interaction. So thank you.